National Chief, thanks so much for joining us. A lot of big items to discuss over the next few days. You'll have the CEO of the Major Projects Office and others to talk about these massive infrastructure projects in the so-called national interest. Do you see these projects announced as divisive among chiefs in Assembly?
Well, I think that this country in particular, and I want to lift up First Nations for always being at the forefront of making change and fighting for Canada at all times, right? Like through World War I, for instance, World War II, Afghanistan, through the pandemic, First Nations have always fought for this country. We're foundational partners, to Canada, and First Nations, own the land from coast to coast to coast. I'll say that very clearly, and but First Nations shared this land in a good way. And so the relationship has not been easy, as you all, as many of your listeners will know. And Canada is also at a crossroads in its relationship with First Nations. Our rights, are always being threatened in different new ways. But we're not afraid. We've been down this road before, and we're far from it. First Nations across this country, of course, are stronger than ever. You will see that at the Assembly this week. And, we can't think of a better place, of course, to talk about Canada's future and the future with the relationship than here at the Assembly this week. We've got a busy agenda and many resolutions to discuss. The Prime Minister will attend, will take questions and, discuss, have a conversation with chiefs in Assembly and First Nations in Assembly. Ministers from all parties and members of Parliament from all parties have been invited to talk about the legislative agenda. And of course, we will be calling on the Prime Minister to honor his commitment to reintroduce the First Nations Clean Water Act. Mm-hmm. We'll also be pushing on the Prime Minister for public safety in First Nations communities, policing as an essential service. I know that those are tough conversations to have, but they're so necessary because First Nations communities, a lot of them don't have access to proper policing services and safety services in their communities. Also, we will be updating chiefs on the historic $23 billion settlement that we negotiated with Prime Minister Trudeau in 2023 regarding the discrimination that happened towards First Nations in the Child and Family Services program. That's been a big rollout on that, and so far we've got 88,000 claims that came in. Close to 300 million has been paid out on that, but there's we know that it's closer to 100,000 people that should be applying. So why are we missing people? And there's that conversation to be had. Where are the rest of these folks? Are they getting the information on time and the communications? I don't know, but I feel like we have to do a further reach out to make sure people are applying that should be applying. Even if they think they don't, they should apply anyways, because we're missing so many people. Mm-hmm. What else? We'll be talking to the government's plan for major infrastructure projects. Over $600 billion of projects are forecasted for First Nations lands over the next decade. They represent a central pillar of Canada's future economic growth. But we have to be very clear that growth and prosperity, we First Nations support that for all, but not at the expense of our rights or of the government's legal obligation to our people. And I think one of our main messaging, you're going to hear that over and over again from chiefs in Assembly, is that Canada can create MOUs, they can create project offices and advisory groups, but chiefs are united when it comes to the approval of large-scale projects on First Nations lands. There's not going to be getting around rights holders. There's not going to be getting around First Nations, and projects and industry and governments have to talk to First Nations, and they have the duty to free, prior, and informed consent with First Nations. I think you'll hear a lot of that this week, and even though there's differing views on that, First Nations are united on that front. That APTN needs to be honored, whether a community agrees or disagrees with one project over another.
You mentioned a lot there, but I know there's also going to be an update on the child welfare reform. The federal government needs to present its national plan to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal on December 22nd. What are your hopes there?
Well, we pushed really hard. The Assembly of First Nations pushed really hard during the budget process here. I know that the budget wasn't anything to champion for First Nations. There's been cuts right across the board in every industry across the country, but we did push really hard to make sure that the 47.8 billion is still there as these discussions continue to happen. Look, we've come through residential schools, day schools, a 60 scoop, now the child welfare system that's kind of taken its place. And we have a long way to unravel that. And I think that I'm so glad that these conversations are finally happening, even though they're really difficult discussions. I'm so glad that people are taking a stand one way or another over our children. And you see things like, one chief called and said, after that discussion, for instance, in Calgary on the vote on the 4 to 7.8 and, that discussion on there. But I'm really thankful to start seeing chiefs question the process on that. And one of the chiefs says, they brought me an apprehension form and I just finally refused. I said, I'm not signing these. And they said, well, you've signed them, your community has signed them for 20 years. And he says, well, I'm not going to sign them anymore. Why do I have to sign this? And then, another community had called and said, finally, their agency released data of where their children were and how many kids were in care. Finally, that province released data to this community after 25 years of them asking. So chiefs are starting to ask hard questions, and I'm really happy for that. And I'm really thankful that they want a new way forward. And those conversations, it's not a one size fits all. It's very complicated, but we have to have them, and I think that we can have them together. So I'm looking forward to the discussion this week.
What would you like to see achieved at this special assembly, and what's your message to those who feel little is accomplished at these meetings?
Look, I think that the AFN has come a long way. I remember I was a little girl when I went to my first one in the early 80s, but even prior to that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Rome wasn't, as they say, Rome wasn't built overnight. These conversations are so necessary. And you see the synergy that sometimes happens between communities and, the conversations that happen and it's a push towards the federal government and the provincial governments on how they deal with us. So there's always that role. At the same time, AFN is not a rights holder. It is a political entity that brings First Nations together to come up with the common way forward on common issues, and also making sure that the diversity is respected on language, on ways of doing things. And so you'll see the chiefs, they're always very strong and unified. And sometimes, of course, there's just like anybody else, there's different decisions to be made, but they are strong and unified together. And you always hear that they're thankful when they come and talk to each other and learn from each other. I mean, yesterday there was one community, one nation telling a whole bunch of other nations in a room. This was, a pre-meeting on how they track membership for their First Nations versus, the government always tracking people, for instance, on First Nations membership. And this one region said, we do that ourselves. We don't allow, the federal government to tell us who we are or who we are not. And they explain that in detail. And so there's always those discussions that happen, and that brings unity, and that helps First Nations to do, to hold the government accountable. The Assembly always holds the government accountable, and they're really tough on and it shows the relevancy. The Prime Minister's coming this week. There's so many ministers that will be attending the Assembly of First Nations this week. There's, everybody knocking at our door trying to get in and on the agenda, but we only have so much time as well because chiefs want time for resolutions. It's the first time ever that a finance minister will be coming to the Assembly of First Nations. He'll be addressing the Assembly on Thursday afternoon. Was it Thursday morning? Thursday morning, I believe. But so it's so necessary. And, to those people that, be united and let's work together and let's try and make the best that we can. And we look back for the history of First Nations people, and we see people rising in a good way. We've got doctors now, lawyers, we've got NHL players. And that's because of the strong leadership in the past that pushed us up and, and made sure that our young people are getting more and more opportunities. And we have a long way to go because there's still so many people suffering out there.
Well, it sounds like we can expect a lot of engagement this week. National Chief, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. That is AFN National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepenak.
Thank you.